Imagine somebody in your family dies in the middle of winter. A week later, another person in the house becomes sick. Then somebody else starts waking up exhausted and saying the dead relative stood beside the bed during the night. A neighbor swears they saw the same person walking near the road after sunset. You don't have a blood test. You don't have a germ theory that explains how one illness can move through a family. You may not have a doctor nearby, and the doctor may not know much more than you do. What you have is a grave, a string of deaths, and a story everybody in the village already knows. The story says the first person didn't stay dead. So people open the grave. The body looks fuller than it did at the funeral. The skin has changed. Dark fluid has reached the mouth. The nails seem longer. Somebody presses a tool into the chest, and the corpse releases a sound. At that point, nobody standing around the grave thinks they're looking at ordinary decomposition. They think they caught the dead person between attacks. That's the vampire I want to talk about. Forget the evening clothes, the castle, and the careful bite marks on the neck. Those belong to a later version. The older vampire was often a swollen corpse from the same village as its victims. It could be a parent, a spouse, a neighbor, or the first person who died during an outbreak. It might leave the grave and attack people at night. In other traditions, it stayed underground and harmed the living from there. The rules changed from one region to another, and even neighboring communities could disagree about what caused a vampire or how to stop one. There was never a single European vampire handbook. There were local beliefs about dangerous dead people, and writers eventually bundled many of them under one name. That makes the survival question harder. You can't walk into every vampire story holding garlic and expect the same result. Some of these dead people weren't described as drinking blood. Sunlight wasn't a universal weapon. A stake might pin the corpse down, pierce it, or release whatever had entered it. Burning could be the final step, though some communities tried less destructive methods first. For this video, I'm keeping the focus on documented European and New England traditions that shaped the vampire people recognize now. I won't treat every restless dead person from every culture as the same creature. That usually creates a fake world map where anything that bites, drains life, or leaves a grave gets called a vampire. The question here is narrower. Before Dracula gave the vampire a famous face, every community had its own answer. We need to sort out which rules were meant to protect the living, and which ones came from misunderstanding a corpse. Then we can test whether any of those precautions would work if the thing behaved the way the stories claimed. The first rule is the one modern vampire stories usually reverse. You should be more suspicious of the person you know. A modern vampire can arrive from somewhere else. The stranger buys a house, moves into the abandoned estate, or gets off a ship carrying several boxes nobody should open. The threat enters the community with a name, a plan, and enough money to make people ignore several obvious warning signs. The older revenant usually begins inside the community. A person dies. Soon afterward, the surviving family members become ill or report nighttime visits. That sequence matters because the accusation grows out of a relationship that already exists. The suspected vampire knows the house because it used to live there. It goes back to a spouse because that was its spouse while alive. It attacks relatives because the disease or string of deaths is happening inside the same family. This is one reason the historical stories feel so mean. The danger isn't waiting beyond the village boundary. The funeral has already happened, and everybody involved may have carried the coffin. Reports from the 18th century vampire panics describe the dead appearing to people in bed, pressing on them, choking them, or leaving them weak. Blood drinking appears in some accounts, but it isn't the only form of attack. A victim could die after saying a dead villager had visited during the night. Once several people made similar claims, the community had a suspect. The accusation didn't always begin with an eyewitness. Sometimes the pattern itself counted as evidence. One person died, then several relatives followed. A body wasting away from disease looked as though something was steadily taking life out of it. If the dead person was believed to remain connected to the household, the deaths could be interpreted as feeding. That idea survived especially well in 19th century New England, where families struck by tuberculosis sometimes believed a dead relative was draining the living. The supposed vampire didn't need to climb through a window. It could remain in the grave and still consume the health of the family. That changes the usual survival plan. Locking the door may do nothing. Leaving a window shut may do nothing. Refusing a stranger entry may do nothing. The threat was already admitted into the family years ago because it used to be a person sitting at the same table. A local vampire also creates an information problem. The people most likely to recognize the suspect are grieving. They may be sick themselves. They have to decide whether a nightmare, a fever, or a familiar shape near the bed means somebody they loved has become dangerous. There isn't much room for a clean, heroic response. You don't identify the monster, gather a group and storm a castle. You listen to a dying person accuse somebody who's already buried, then ask the dead person's family for permission to dig them up. Some reports show officials hesitating while villagers demand action. That hesitation makes sense. Refusing could mean watching frightened residents abandon their homes or take matters into their own hands. Agreeing meant allowing a corpse to be opened, pierced, dismembered, or burned. If the villagers were right, delay gave the vampire more nights to attack. If they were wrong, the community was about to mutilate an ordinary dead person during an outbreak. The older stories rarely offer a safe middle choice. From a survival angle, the local connection gives you one useful warning. A cluster matters more than a single frightening night. If several people from the same household become ill after one death, and each reports the same dead person, the folklore says you should take that pattern seriously. The problem is that real infectious disease creates the same pattern without any vampire. Relatives share rooms, air, food, work, and long periods of close contact. The person blamed for returning may have been the first visible victim of the same illness now killing everyone else. The folklore reads the order backward. The dead person appears to be causing the later deaths because they died first. In reality, they may have been the first person the community noticed. That mistake shaped one of the most important vampire rules: pay attention to who dies first. There wasn't one reliable list of people who became vampires. Local rules could name sinners, people who died violently, people denied proper burial, people under a curse, outsiders, suicides, alleged witches, or somebody who broke a religious or social rule. A suspicious death could matter as much as a suspicious life. When a person died suddenly, there was no long illness to prepare the family or explain what happened. Murder, suicide, drowning, an accident, or an unknown sickness could leave the death feeling unfinished. A community that already believed some dead people returned had a ready explanation for what came next. In parts of Greek tradition, the dangerous revenant was tied to sin, improper religious standing, or a body that failed to decay as expected. The Greek vrykolakas wasn't identical to the Serbian vampire, and even the name changed meaning across time and place. What stays familiar is the fear that a person can fail to pass fully into death. The state of the body becomes part of the person's moral record. A corpse that remains intact may look holy in one context and monstrous in another. People don't only ask what the body is doing. They ask what kind of person this was, and what the condition of the corpse must mean. That is dangerous for anyone who already sat near the edge of the community. A stranger could be blamed because nobody knew their family or burial customs. A person with an unusual body, illness, behavior, or reputation could attract suspicion. So could the first person to die when an epidemic entered a village. Archaeologists and historians have to be careful here because an unusual burial doesn't tell us exactly what the living believed about that individual. A sickle across a throat or a stone beneath a chin strongly suggests fear and prevention, but it doesn't provide a confession from the people who arranged the grave. The word vampire can make every unusual burial look settled when the evidence isn't. Still, the preventative logic is visible. The living expected movement and tried to block it. They expected biting and obstructed the mouth. They expected the corpse to rise and placed a blade where that movement would become destructive. A person could also become dangerous through contact with another vampire. That idea appears in the Arnold Paole report. Paole was said to have told people that a vampire had troubled him while he was alive. He tried to protect himself by eating earth from the vampire's grave and smearing himself with its blood. After Paole later died in an accident, villagers blamed him for a new set of deaths. Even the attempted cure became part of the explanation. He had handled material from a vampire, so the danger may have followed him. This is very different from the clean bite rule in a lot of modern fiction. There isn't always a visible transfer at the neck. You might become a vampire because of how you died, how you lived, how you were buried, or contact with the wrong dead person. The accusation might also begin after everyone was already frightened. That makes prevention almost impossible for the person being accused. You may have no control over what happens to your body, how quickly it decomposes, or what sickness reaches your family after your funeral. For the living, the folklore gives a broader rule: treat burial as a security step. A proper funeral wasn't only for respect or grief. In some traditions, it helped move the dead into the right place and kept the relationship between body, soul, and community in order. When something went wrong, the second burial or later destruction of the corpse was meant to correct it. That correction could happen after the attacks began. It could also happen before burial when somebody was already considered risky. From a practical survival standpoint, preventive burial is stronger than waiting for the first attack. If the threat can be pinned, blocked, bound, or redirected before it wakes, nobody has to identify it while people are dying. The cost is obvious. Preventive rules are easy to use against people who can't defend themselves. Once a community believes a certain kind of death or person creates a revenant, fear can justify whatever happens to the body. The dead person doesn't get to prove the rule wrong. The next problem is proving the vampire exists at all. The living need signs, and many of the signs begin in a bedroom. Historical vampire attacks don't always look like the attacks in the film. There may be no puncture wounds. Nobody sees a pale figure bending over a throat. A person becomes weak, has trouble breathing, wakes from a frightening dream, or says a dead relative pressed down on them during the night. Sleep paralysis can produce an experience that fits that description with awful precision. A person wakes while the body is still unable to move. Breathing can feel difficult. Pressure on the chest is common. The mind may create a figure in the room or directly on top of the bed. That doesn't explain every old report, and we can't diagnose a person from a sentence written centuries ago. It does show how a sincere witness can experience a nighttime attack without anyone entering the house. Fever creates another route. A person who is already seriously ill may dream about the relative who died before them. Their family hears the accusation while watching the same disease progress. If several patients repeat it, the story gains weight. The vampire can also appear through rumor. Somebody sees the dead person on a road. Another person hears footsteps near the house. A widow says her husband returned. Details move through a small community quickly, especially when everyone is waiting to learn who will become sick next. Once the story settles on one suspect, ordinary events start pointing in the same direction. A noise at night becomes a visit. A nightmare becomes an attack. A new death becomes another victim. This doesn't mean the witnesses were lying. Fear changes attention. People notice what fits the danger they're trying to understand. The strongest reports combine three kinds of evidence. The living describe attacks. People die. The suspect's body looks wrong when the grave is opened. That last part matters because it seems physical. Dreams can be dismissed. Rumors can be challenged. A body with fresh-looking skin and dark fluid at the mouth feels like proof anyone can touch. The villagers in the Peter Plogojowitz case didn't ask an official to believe a story forever. They asked him to attend an exhumation. The grave would answer the question. From their point of view, this is almost an investigation. They have a suspect, victim statements, a time pattern, and a test. If the body has the recognized marks, the suspect is a vampire. If it has decomposed normally, the search may move elsewhere. The trouble is that the test is built from expectations about death that don't match what bodies actually do. A corpse can swell. Fluid can leave the mouth and nose. Skin can slip, exposing a layer underneath that looks newer. Hair and nails can appear longer as the surrounding skin changes. Gases can move through the body. A stake or blade can force fluid out and produce a sound. Every one of those changes can make the body look active. Cold weather, soil, coffin construction, moisture, body size, cause of death, and the time since burial all affect decomposition. Two relatives buried years apart won't look the same when opened on the same day. A recently dead person stored through a frozen winter may look far less decomposed than someone buried during warm weather. The folklore treats difference as evidence. Forensic knowledge treats difference as expected. That gap is where the vampire becomes visible. If you were living inside the belief system, the safest response would be to document the attacks before opening a grave. You'd want the exact order of illness, who reported seeing whom, whether the accounts match before people compare stories, and whether the supposed victims already shared the same disease. People in the 18th century didn't have modern testing, though they could still notice contradictions. Officials sometimes recorded what they saw, and skeptical writers argued over whether the reports proved anything supernatural. The word vampire spread because those records traveled. A local fear became a European controversy once administrators, physicians, clergy, and newspapers began repeating the cases. The grave inspection was meant to settle the matter. Instead, it produced the details that made the stories famous. So before we get to the major cases, we need to look at the body they thought they found. The classic folkloric vampire didn't need to look elegant. It needed to look insufficiently dead. That could mean the body hadn't collapsed. The skin seemed ruddy or dark instead of pale. The stomach was swollen. The joints still moved. The mouth contained blood or a blood-like liquid. The old skin or nails appeared to have been replaced. The burial cloth showed stains or damage. A person opening the grave expected a dry, motionless body that had steadily become less human. A swollen face and wet mouth looked like the opposite process. The corpse seemed to have gained substance after burial. That is where feeding enters the explanation. If the body appears fuller while living people become thinner, the vampire seems to be taking material from them. Normal decomposition can create that exact visual contrast. After death, cells begin breaking down. Bacteria already present in the body continue working. Gases accumulate and cause swelling, first internally and then across visible parts of the body. The abdomen can enlarge. The face may swell. Skin changes color. Blisters form, and layers of skin can loosen or slip. None of that looks calm when you see it without preparation. The fluid at the mouth is especially persuasive. Modern forensic descriptions call one version post-mortem purging. Decomposition gases and internal pressure can force dark fluid through the mouth and nose. A witness who believes the dead person has been drinking blood has no reason to call it decomposition fluid. It is exactly where stolen blood should be. Then somebody drives a stake into the body. The pressure changes. Fluid comes out. Gas escapes. The chest or throat produces a noise. To the people around the grave, the vampire has reacted to being struck. It bleeds and cries out. The action confirms the belief because the response looks immediate. Nobody needs to wait for a second test. They can burn the body and watch the physical evidence disappear. Hair and nails create another familiar sign. They don't continue growing after death. As skin dehydrates, retracts, slips, or breaks down, more of the hair shaft and nail can become visible. The effect is easy to read as growth when the body is being compared with a memory from the funeral. The idea of fresh skin has a similar explanation. The outer layer can loosen and come away. What remains underneath may look newer, pinker, or wetter. An 18th century witness describing old skin and new skin isn't inventing an impossible observation. The interpretation is the problem. Flexible joints don't prove life either. Rigor mortis appears and later passes. A body can become movable again as tissues change. The timing depends on conditions, and burial complicates whatever simple schedule people expect. Even the absence of a strong odor is unreliable. Temperature and burial conditions matter. A cold body can change slowly. A sealed environment can alter what the people opening it notice first. Smell is also subjective when a crowd has already decided what the grave contains. I don't think most people understand how visually active decomposition is. Popular images jump from a person who looks asleep to a dry skeleton. The middle is full of pressure, color changes, fluids, skin movement, bloating, insect activity, and tissue breakdown. A community that never sees a body after burial may only encounter that process during an emergency exhumation. The first time they see it is also the moment everybody is asking whether the corpse has been feeding. That is a terrible test condition. The body can't give a neutral result because almost any stage can be interpreted in the folklore's favor. Too fresh means it is undead. Bloated means it is full of blood. Fluid at the mouth means it is fed. A torn shroud means it has been chewing. Movement during handling means it resisted. A sound means it cried out. Even advanced decay may not clear the suspect if the community expects a different person in the same grave. The test has no stable control. For survival, this matters because a rule that always confirms itself can't help you identify the right threat. You may destroy the first body and see the deaths continue. Then the accusation moves to another grave. Some vampire panics expanded that way. A first suspected revenant was destroyed, then later deaths were blamed on people supposedly infected by it. The investigation could move through a cemetery. If the vampire were real, opening the grave could still be a dangerous moment. The stories often assume the corpse is strongest at night, or returns to the grave before morning. That gives the community a daylight window to act. They gather witnesses, bring the necessary tools, and plan to finish the destruction before the next attack. If the vampire is only active away from the grave, catching it inside the coffin is sensible. You avoid a chase and attack the body while it is confined. The practical weakness is that the body may not stay confined once the grave is disturbed. The people doing the work are close enough to touch it, and some methods require reaching the chest, neck, mouth, or limbs. If the corpse can wake suddenly, the first row around the grave has almost no reaction time. Historical reports don't usually describe the suspected vampire leaping up during the exhumation. The danger appears through bleeding, sounds, or later attacks. That lets the group work as though the body is physically passive even while believing it is supernaturally active. The methods are built around that contradiction. The vampire can kill people from the grave, yet it can be handled by a group once exposed. The safest strategy in the old stories is collective. One person alone is vulnerable at night and unable to open a grave safely. A group can compare reports, watch the burial site, restrain the body, and complete whatever rite the community believes is necessary. You still have to choose the right rite. The next rule is simple in principle: stop the corpse from moving. The ways people tried to do that were much less simple. A wooden stake is the best known tool, though the reason for using one isn't always the same. In a lot of modern stories, the stake is a precise kill switch. Put it through the heart, and the vampire dies immediately. Miss the heart, and you may have made the situation worse. Older practices could be more physical. A stake pinned the corpse to the ground. It fixed the body in place so the dead person couldn't rise. The material, location, and ritual changed by region. Some reports describe the heart being pierced. Others include decapitation, burning, or removal of organs after staking. The point was often to make return impossible. That could mean separating the head from the body. It could mean burning the corpse until nothing recognizable remained. It could mean turning the body face down so that, if it tried to dig, it would move deeper into the earth. Limbs might be tied, nailed, or weighted. Sharp objects could be placed across the neck or torso before the grave was closed. A stone under the chin could keep the mouth shut. A brick or earth placed inside the mouth could stop chewing or feeding. Coins and religious objects might protect the body from occupation, or give the dead something harmless to bite. These methods are sometimes grouped together as anti-vampire burials. Archaeologists usually use more careful terms such as unusual, deviant, or apotropaic burial because the same object can carry more than one meaning. A sickle was a tool, a symbol, and a possible weapon. A coin in the mouth may belong to a burial custom without proving that anyone expected the corpse to drink blood. Context matters. At the post-medieval cemetery called Dracula I in Poland, researchers found 6 burials with unusual protective features among hundreds of otherwise ordinary graves. 5 had sickles placed across the throat or abdomen. 2 had large stones near the throat or beneath the chin. The people were not all the same age or sex, and later chemical analysis suggested they were local rather than obvious outsiders. The sickles are frightening because the intended mechanics seem easy to read. If the body rises, the blade cuts the throat or opens the abdomen. The weapon waits for the corpse to move first. That is a better trap than leaving a loose stake in the coffin. Nobody has to stand nearby when it activates. It also reveals how literally the living imagined the return. The revenant was expected to sit up or push against the grave. The countermeasure uses that motion against it. A heavy stone works differently. It blocks the throat, holds the jaw, or adds weight. Stones placed on the chest or limbs can pin the body down. Burying a person face down redirects the first movement. Tying the legs prevents walking. Removing the head eliminates biting and separates thought from movement, assuming the revenant needs both. Burning is the most complete answer because it removes the body that keeps causing the problem. It is also the hardest step for a family to accept. The person may have been buried with religious care only days earlier. Now the community wants to pull them apart and put them into a fire. Some accounts delay burning until other attempts fail. That makes emotional sense. Piercing an organ or changing the burial still leaves a body to rebury. Fire feels final in a way a second grave doesn't. From a survival perspective, the methods fall into 4 categories. The first is containment. Weight the body, bind it, bury it face down, or pin it in place. The second is obstruction. Fill the mouth, close the jaw, block the throat, or remove whatever the revenant uses to attack. The third is separation. Take off the head, remove the heart, or divide the body so it can't function as one thing. The fourth is destruction. Burn the remains or reduce them far enough that return no longer seems possible. I wouldn't trust containment by itself if the stories are accurate. A vampire blamed for harming people while still inside the grave doesn't need to sit up. Weighting the body only works against a creature that physically leaves. Obstructing the mouth has the same problem. It helps against biting or shroud chewing. It does nothing against a revenant that spreads illness, appears in dreams, or strangles people without feeding. Separation is stronger because it targets the body's ability to act. Destruction is strongest because it removes the body from the system entirely. The old stories seem to reach the same conclusion. Many of the famous cases end with burning, even when a stake comes first. There is a practical danger nobody in the folklore could fully measure. Opening bodies during an outbreak is a bad public health decision. People gather close together. They handle remains and contaminated material. They may drink preparations made from burned organs. The ritual meant to stop disease can expose more people to it. That doesn't mean every historical exhumation spread infection. It means the method adds risks while aiming at the wrong cause. The best real-world survival rule would have been the opposite. Keep the grave closed, reduce close contact, improve ventilation, and treat the illness affecting the living. That answer was not available to people who had no way to identify the pathogen and no reliable treatment. They acted on the danger they understood. The Peter Plogojowitz case shows how quickly that danger could take control of a village. In 1725, a man recorded in German sources as Peter Plogojowitz died in the Serbian village of Kisilova, now usually identified with Kisiljevo. His Serbian name is commonly rendered Petar Blagojevich. Roughly 10 weeks after his burial, a group of villagers died after short illnesses. The official report says the dying accused Plogojowitz of coming to them in their sleep, lying on them, and throttling them. The village decided it had a vampire. They asked the local imperial official, often identified as Frembald, to attend the exhumation. He didn't sound eager. The villagers reportedly threatened to leave the village if he refused because they believed the same thing would happen to them next. That detail is important. Fear had already made ordinary government difficult. The official could either authorize the inspection or watch the community break apart. A priest was present. The grave was opened. The body appeared unusually preserved to the witnesses. The report describes hair, beard, and nails that seemed to have grown. It says the old skin had come away, and fresher skin appeared beneath it. Blood was visible at the mouth. Those are the signs people had been taught to expect. Once the body passed the test, the villagers drove a stake into it. The report says fresh blood came from the mouth and ears, along with other reactions the official chose not to describe in detail. The corpse was then burned. The account spread because it was not only a village story. An administrator had put his name to what he saw. The language remained cautious in places, but the basic sequence was there in an official document. Deaths, accusations, exhumation, preserved corpse, staking, blood, fire. For a reader in another country, that looks much stronger than a campfire story. The writer doesn't need to claim that he watched the vampire walk. He only needs to report that the villagers recognized one, and that the body displayed the expected marks. The case also contains almost every problem we have already covered. The supposed attacks happened during sleep. The victims became ill and died quickly. The suspect was a known member of the village who had died first. The body was judged against a folk model of decomposition. Piercing it produced fluid that looked like confirmation. Once the body was burned, the case had an ending. If the deaths stopped, destruction worked. If they continued, another person could be blamed. We don't have enough medical information to diagnose the village from the report. Claiming a specific disease would create certainty the document can't support. What we can say is that several people died in a short period, and the community explained that cluster through a returning corpse. Surviving inside their version of events would depend on what happens before the exhumation. Don't sleep alone once several people report the same nocturnal attacker. Keep witnesses in the room. Record whether the figure appears to more than one person at the same time. Move the sick away from the household if that can be done safely. Avoid sharing bedding and enclosed air. Those steps help whether the threat is supernatural, infectious, or related to sleep. If the dead person physically enters the room, a watch gives you another pair of eyes and a chance to follow it back. The folklore often assumes the revenant returns to the grave. Tracking it would identify the right burial without relying only on a dying accusation. If the attack occurs while nobody else can see anything, that points toward illness, dream, or sleep paralysis. It doesn't make the victim dishonest. It changes what kind of help they need. Once the village opens the grave, stand back. The historical method puts too many people close to a pressurized, decomposing body. Let the smallest number of prepared people handle it. Don't put your face over the coffin. Don't drink any preparation made from the remains. If the creature can rise, restrain it before piercing. The report doesn't describe that precaution, probably because the body itself never moved in the way a modern film vampire would. The villagers' final method is extreme, but it matches the threat they believed they had. A corpse that repeatedly leaves the grave can't return once the body has been completely burned. Plogojowitz became one of the cases that pushed the vampire into wider European discussion. The next case gave that discussion something even more powerful. It brought in a medical team. The name in the report appears in several forms, including Arnold Paole and Arnold Paole. He was a Hajak living in the Serbian village of Medveja, which sat in territory controlled by the Habsburg monarchy after war with the Ottoman Empire. According to the people interviewed, Paole had once said a vampire troubled him near Kosovo. He tried a folk remedy. He ate earth from the suspected vampire's grave and smeared himself with its blood. Later, Paole died after falling from a hay wagon and breaking his neck. Within weeks, villagers said he appeared at night and tormented people. Several died. His body was exhumed after about 40 days, and was said to show the familiar signs: little decay, fresh blood, and blood-stained burial material. The villagers drove a stake through his heart, removed his head, and burned the remains. They also treated the people believed to have died because of him. That should have ended it. Years later, another cluster of deaths struck the village. The explanation grew more complicated. The later victims were connected to livestock said to have been attacked by earlier vampires. People who ate the meat were thought to have carried the danger forward. At that point, vampire belief starts behaving like an infection model. The threat moves through contact. A person can be affected without meeting the original revenant. An animal becomes part of the chain. The first destroyed body doesn't end the outbreak because the contamination has already spread. A military medical investigation arrived in early 1732. The resulting report is known as visum et repertum, meaning something close to seen and discovered, or seen and found. The team questioned residents and opened multiple graves. The report described some bodies as decomposed, and others as showing signs the investigators associated with vampirism. Several were subjected to destructive treatment. Heads were removed. Bodies were burned. Ashes were disposed of. The document circulated widely and helped turn a regional fear into an international argument. Doctors and scholars now had a formal report to discuss. Some took the evidence seriously. Others tried to explain it through burial conditions, disease, imagination, or fraud. The Paole story is especially useful for survival analysis because its rules expand over time. First, direct contact with a vampire's grave and blood may contaminate you, even when you use that contact as protection. Second, a person who dies after that contact can return. Third, the returned dead can affect livestock. Fourth, eating an affected animal can pass the danger onward. That chain gives the vampire more reach than a creature that only attacks one person at night. It also means the visible corpse is no longer the whole threat. Burning Paole can't undo meat that has already been eaten. If we accept the report's logic, the survival response needs quarantine. Stop eating animals linked to unexplained deaths. Separate the sick. Track who had contact with the original victim, the grave, the blood, and the livestock. Don't use material from a suspected vampire as medicine. The last rule should be obvious, but the folklore contains several remedies that use the dangerous thing against itself. Earth from the grave, blood from the corpse, ashes from burned organs, or other remains may be consumed, or applied to the body. The logic is familiar. A controlled amount of the threat protects you from the larger threat. People have used similar ideas in medicine and magic for a long time. The difference is that these vampire remedies were not prepared under conditions that made them safe. Eating grave earth and smearing blood from a corpse onto the skin creates new ways to get sick. The Paole case also demonstrates why destroying one suspect doesn't always reassure a community. The story can preserve itself by explaining failure as spread. If people keep dying after the vampire is burned, that doesn't prove the accusation was wrong. It proves the vampire created more vampires first. A belief that can expand like that becomes very hard to end. Every failed intervention adds another hidden stage. The official investigators treated the bodies they judged suspicious, but they couldn't test the underlying rule. They didn't have a way to show whether the later deaths came from the dead, the animals, contaminated food, or a disease moving through the village for ordinary reasons. The formal report made the case look settled while leaving the cause unknown. That is one of the reasons it lasted. The next type of revenant needed even less movement. It could remain underground, chew its own shroud, and still kill the people above it. In parts of Central and Northern European tradition, stories describe corpses that chewed inside their graves. The German term Nachtzehrer is often translated as after-devourer. This creature doesn't need to climb out of the coffin. Its mouth is the weapon, and the burial shroud becomes the first thing it consumes. As it chews, people connected to it may weaken and die. Some accounts link the chewing dead with plague. The corpse eats fabric, parts of itself, or something placed near the mouth while the lives of relatives are consumed above ground. The image is horrible because it turns a closed coffin into an active space. The burial doesn't contain the danger. The grave hides the feeding. People listening above the grave might report noises. When the body was exhumed, the shroud could appear torn, drawn into the mouth, or stained with fluid. That gave the story physical evidence. Decomposition offers several ordinary ways for the cloth to move or look damaged. Fluid from the mouth can wet and darken it. The jaw and soft tissues change. The shroud sags. Insects and decay alter the material. If the cloth settles near the lips, it can look as though the corpse pulled it inward. The remedy was built around the mouth. People might remove the shroud, place earth or a stone between the jaws, add a coin, or otherwise stop the corpse from chewing. More violent versions included decapitation, piercing, or burning. The gentler method makes sense if the revenant's harmful action is specific. Stop the chewing, and you stop the deaths without destroying the whole body. It is also one of the few vampire rules that could be tested quickly inside the belief. If the family improves after the mouth is blocked, the rite worked. If they don't, the community may escalate. The weakness is the same one we found with containment. A mouthful of earth only helps against a creature that needs its mouth. It does nothing if the real cause is disease. It may also expose the people opening the grave to exactly the conditions that made them sick in the first place. The chewing dead shows why vampire can be a misleadingly tidy label. This isn't the same predator as Count Dracula. It may not leave the grave, seduce anyone, or drink from a neck. It behaves more like a supernatural explanation for wasting and contagion. Its victim can die without seeing it. That makes avoidance difficult. You can't stay off the road at night or refuse to enter an abandoned house. Your defense depends on the burial being performed correctly and the right corpse being identified. If you lived in a place where people feared this kind of revenant, your practical plan would begin at the funeral. Keep cloth away from the mouth. Secure the jaw. Use whatever accepted protective object doesn't require reopening the grave later. Record the burial so a changed shroud isn't judged against a faulty memory. I'm treating those as story rules, not instructions for real funerals. The real safety response is to leave human remains to trained professionals and investigate illness among the living. Inside the folklore, though, prevention is the only low-risk option. Waiting until the family becomes sick means the community must open the grave and perform the rite after the supposed feeding has begun. The chewing dead also gives us a useful test for modern vampire knowledge. Garlic doesn't solve this. Sunlight doesn't reach it. An invitation rule is irrelevant. A cross may have religious meaning, though the physical problem remains under the soil. The monster can win without entering your house. An old vampire survival guide has to begin with the grave instead of the doorway. The Serbian cases helped turn the word vampire into a European sensation. A different account from the Greek island of Mykonos shows why the word never describes one perfectly fixed creature. Around the beginning of the 18th century, the French traveler and botanist Joseph Pitton de Tournefort visited the island. He later published an account of a dead man whom the islanders believed had become a vrykolakas. Tournefort didn't believe the corpse was walking. His tone is skeptical and often mocking. That makes the account useful for one reason and dangerous for another. He records what outsiders said happened, but he also writes about the islanders as people whose beliefs he considers foolish. We're seeing the event through somebody who wanted readers to recognize his own rationality. According to his description, the trouble began after a man was killed. People claim the dead man entered houses at night, overturned furniture, extinguished lamps, grabbed residents from behind, and emptied bottles or jars. This revenant was not a silent blood drinker. He was an aggressive nuisance who could make ordinary life impossible. The attacks continued, so the islanders opened the grave. The body was examined, and an attempt was made to remove and burn the heart. That didn't end the reports. Return Effort wrote that the Revenant's activity became more frequent after the intervention. People left their homes. Families carried possessions away. The island's fear grew until the entire body was burned. The sequence tells us several things about survival inside this tradition. One warning is that damaging the corpse can make the situation worse if the treatment is incomplete. Removing the heart isn't automatically the final answer. The body may need to be burned completely, and the timing or religious procedure may matter. The vrykolakas can also behave like a haunting. It enters homes, moves objects, bothers residents, and creates public disorder. You may never see it feeding. You recognize it by repeated intrusion. The community doesn't need one consistent witness either. The number of reports becomes evidence. Each new disturbance makes the next one easier to believe. Turnford offered ordinary explanations for some of what he saw during the exhumation. He described warmth and flexible tissue in ways that can be explained by decomposition and the conditions inside the body. He also suspected people were using the panic to commit theft or cause trouble while blaming the dead man. That possibility matters. Once everybody accepts that a revenant is entering houses, a living person can exploit the story. Missing food, damaged belongings, and nighttime noises already have an explanation. The more frightened the island becomes, the easier it is for an ordinary intruder to hide inside the supernatural one. A useful survival rule follows from the skeptical version of the story. Don't stop watching the living because you are afraid of the dead. Secure doors. Keep track of who has access to each house. Compare reports before details spread. Check whether objects were moved by somebody who benefits from the confusion. If a whole community expects a dead man to be everywhere at once, somebody alive can act with very little scrutiny. Inside the folklore, however, those precautions only address part of the danger. The body still has to be treated according to the regional rules. Burning becomes the decisive act because lesser measures failed. That creates another problem. Fire destroys the evidence along with the suspect. If the attacks stop, the burning gets credit. If they continue, somebody else may be blamed. There is no way to examine the same body again and ask whether the first judgment was wrong. Turnford's account also shows how quickly a local revenant could become entertainment for distant readers. The islanders' fear, the corpse, the removed heart, and the final burning became part of a travel narrative. The story left Mykonos even if the dead man never did. By the time readers across Europe encountered reports like this, Serbian vampire investigations, and older stories of chewing corpses, the dangerous dead had become a subject for argument. Physicians, clergy, administrators, travelers, and writers could all use the same case for different purposes. One person saw proof of the undead. Another saw ignorance. Another saw fraud. Another saw a medical process nobody present understood. The grave remained at the center of the dispute. Centuries later, archaeology lets us examine some of the precautions without relying entirely on written witnesses. Archaeologists sometimes find a sickle laid across a throat, a stone beneath a chin, or a body whose bones were rearranged after burial. The discovery often reaches the news under a simple label, vampire grave. The label is useful because people immediately understand the basic idea. Somebody feared this dead person and tried to stop the body from rising or biting. It can also make the evidence sound more certain than it is. A grave preserves actions. It doesn't preserve the entire explanation for those actions. At the Dracula Cemetery in northwestern Poland, excavations uncovered hundreds of post-medieval burials. 6 stood out because of unusual protective treatment. 5 had sickles placed across the neck or abdomen. 2 had large stones positioned at the throat or beneath the chin. The apparent mechanics are easy to understand. If the corpse tries to rise, the blade cuts into it. If the corpse tries to bite or feed, the stone blocks the mouth or throat. The people buried this way were not separated into a distant corner. They were placed among other members of the cemetery. That detail makes the situation more complicated than a simple burial of hated outsiders. Researchers tested whether these individuals had come from somewhere else. Strontium isotope evidence from their teeth indicated that the 6 people were local to the region, at least during the part of childhood recorded by the enamel. That result matters because outsider status is often offered as an easy explanation for unusual treatment. At Drasko, the people given these burials were not simply strangers dropped into a hostile community. They may have been suspected because of how they died. When they died, a local epidemic, their reputation, a physical trait, or some fact that left no mark on the skeleton. The archaeological evidence can't choose among all of those possibilities. It can tell us the fear was organized. A sickle across the body is placed before the grave is filled. Somebody obtained it, positioned it, and allowed the burial to continue. The precaution was not a panicked attack performed years later. It was built into the funeral. That is the preventive version of vampire survival. The community doesn't wait for a nighttime visitor. It decides the person is risky at death and sets a trap inside the grave. From a purely tactical view, that is safer for the living than a later exhumation. Nobody has to reopen a decomposing body during an outbreak. Nobody has to stand close while a stake is driven into a swollen chest. The dangerous dead are contained before the alleged attacks begin. The moral cost is still severe. Suspicion becomes enough to alter the burial permanently. The person may have done nothing except die first. The Drasko study raised epidemic disease as one possible setting for these customs. In a community watching illness move from person to person, the first dead body can become the point where prevention is concentrated. Stop that body, and perhaps the chain ends. Modern viewers may laugh at the blade until they remember the problem the burial was trying to solve. People were not decorating a grave for a horror story. They were trying to prevent another death with the knowledge available to them. Their explanation was wrong, but the fear was attached to something real. Families were dying in sequence. Bodies did change after burial. The dead sometimes looked less decomposed than expected. The living wanted a physical action they could take. A buried blade gave them one. Other graves show intervention after decomposition. John Barber, whose remains were found in an unmarked cemetery in Griswold, Connecticut, had been disturbed after death. His femurs were removed and crossed over his chest. Later research identified him as a 55-year-old farmer who had tuberculosis. The crossed bones were not the treatment of a fresh corpse. The arrangement required people to reopen the grave after soft tissue had broken down enough to expose the skeleton. The suspicion survived for years. The people who returned to the grave didn't need to find a body that looked newly alive. They could treat the bones themselves as a threat. Rearranging the skeleton prevented the dead man from walking or rising in the form the community feared. This is a reminder that anti-vampire practices don't all depend on misunderstood bloating. Some were performed long after the corpse had passed that stage. The belief could attach to the identity of the dead person, not only the appearance of the body. Archaeology also warns us against building one universal rulebook. A sickle burial in Poland, crossed femurs in Connecticut, and a heart removed on Mykonos come from different communities with different ideas. They share a goal, but the methods don't prove one continuous secret tradition. The useful pattern is broader. People expected the dead to act through the body. They changed the body so the action became impossible. Pin the torso. Block the mouth. Separate the head. Cross the legs. Turn the body. Weigh it down. Burn the part believed to carry the threat. Every method is a physical answer to a specific imagined movement. That gives us a way to judge any old vampire remedy. Ask what action it is supposed to prevent. If nobody can explain that, the remedy may be symbolic, borrowed from another tradition, or added later by a storyteller. The New England cases make the same logic visible in a setting much closer to modern medicine. The families had doctors. Newspapers reported the events. Robert Koch had already identified the bacterium that causes tuberculosis by the time Mercy Brown's grave was opened. The knowledge existed. It hadn't reached every frightened household in a form that could save them. The New England vampire was often a family member blamed for consumption. Consumption was the common 19th century name for tuberculosis. The disease could move slowly through a household. A person coughed, weakened, lost weight, and sometimes produced blood. Months or years later, another relative showed the same decline. Without a clear understanding of airborne transmission, the sequence looked like a dead family member was using the living to maintain itself. The belief didn't always describe a corpse walking through the night. The suspected vampire could remain underground and still drain the family. The remedy therefore focused on the body in the grave rather than the house. People opened the grave and examined the organs. If a heart or liver still contained blood, or seemed preserved, that could identify the guilty corpse. The organ might be burned. In some cases, the ashes were used in a remedy for the sick relative. From inside the belief, that creates a closed circuit. The vampire took life from the family. Burning its heart breaks the connection. Giving the ashes to the victim returns power from the dead to the living. From a medical perspective, none of it treats tuberculosis. It also exposed participants to human remains and delays attention to the people who are still sick. The most famous New England case is Mercy Brown. Mercy lived in Exeter, Rhode Island. Tuberculosis had already killed her mother and one of her sisters. Her brother Edwin became ill as well. Mercy died in January 1892 after a comparatively fast decline. By then, people around the family were desperate. Edwin had gone west for his health and returned. He continued getting worse. Reports said he dreamed that his dead sister was visiting or calling him. In March, the bodies of the women in the family were examined. Mercy's mother and sister had been buried for years and had largely decomposed. Mercy had died during winter and was likely held in a stone crypt before her final burial because the ground was frozen. Her body was far better preserved. That difference was treated as evidence. It should have been expected. Mercy had been dead for a much shorter time, and freezing conditions slowed decomposition. The comparison placed a winter-preserved body beside relatives buried years earlier, and asked why one looked fresher. The answer was in the calendar. The story says Mercy's heart and liver were removed and burned. Ashes were given to Edwin in a final attempt to save him. He died on May 2nd, 1892. The failed remedy didn't make the family's fear foolish. It shows how far people will go when every available treatment has failed and another person is dying in front of them. It also shows why medical knowledge on paper isn't the same as public protection. Robert Koch announced the discovery of the bacterium that causes tuberculosis in 1882, 10 years before Mercy's exhumation. That didn't instantly give rural families antibiotics, reliable testing, or a clear public health system. Effective drug treatment was still decades away. A person could hear that germs cause disease and still have no cure to offer Edwin Brown. Folklore offered an action. Open the grave, find the organ, burn it, give the sick man the remains. The action was specific, visible, and immediate. Medicine could explain more than it could fix. That tension helps the vampire belief survive beside modernity. People don't abandon an old remedy simply because somebody has named the disease. They abandon it when the new explanation produces results they can see and trust. The John Barber burial shows that Mercy Brown was not an isolated invention. When Barber's grave was discovered in Connecticut in 1990, the cross femur suggested his body had been rearranged after burial to keep him from rising. Evidence on his remains indicated tuberculosis. Later genetic and genealogical research supported his identification. He appears to have been a local man, not a mysterious foreigner. Like the older European revenants, the threat came from inside the community. New England cases used different treatments. A body might be turned over. Bones might be rearranged. Organs could be burned. The selected corpse was often the first family member to die, though communities didn't follow one exact procedure. The common logic was transmission through the dead. Tuberculosis made that logic especially convincing because the disease could remain hidden before becoming active. One relative died. Another seemed healthy for a while. Then the same wasting began. Modern medicine explains that gap through infection and disease progression. The vampire story explained it as continued feeding. The symptoms also matched the language. The person looked drained. Their face became pale. Their bodies seemed consumed. Blood appeared when they coughed. At night, breathing problems and fever dreams could produce experiences of pressure, suffocation, or visits from the dead. A community didn't need to invent a gothic monster. The disease provided most of the imagery. For survival inside the New England belief, the recommended plan would be grimly practical. Identify the first family member who died. Examine the body. Remove the organ believed to contain the remaining life. Burn it. Use the ashes according to local custom. That plan fails because the disease is moving among the living through shared air, not from the organ in the grave. The real survival plan is almost the reverse. Don't gather a crowd for an exhumation. Don't make a sick person consume human remains. Separate the supernatural accusation from the medical emergency. Look for patterns of close contact and shared symptoms. Improve ventilation. Seek testing and treatment from professionals. Those instructions are easy to give now because tuberculosis is understood and treatable. They were far harder to carry out in a 19th century household with limited access to care. Mercy Brown's story is often presented as the last great American vampire case, which gives it a satisfying place at the end of an era. Real belief doesn't stop cleanly. Folk practices persist unevenly. One community may abandon them while another repeats them years later. The more important ending is that the vampire changed jobs. The grave revenant had explained disease inside a family. The literary vampire would become a stranger, an aristocrat, a seducer, an invader, and eventually an entire species with standardized abilities. Once that version took over, the old survival rules became difficult to recognize. Before Dracula, writers had already begun turning the vampire into a character who could enter fashionable rooms. John Polidori's story The Vampire appeared in 1819. Its vampire, Lord Ruthven, was not a swollen villager identified during an exhumation. He was an aristocratic predator who moved through society, fascinated people, and destroyed them. That shift gave the monster mobility. A grave revenant is tied to one death and one community. Ruthven can travel. He can choose victims who never knew him while he was alive. His danger comes partly from status and charm. People let him close because he appears powerful, controlled, and socially acceptable. The survival problem moves from funeral practice to judgment. You have to recognize the predator before anybody believes he is one. Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, didn't invent the vampire. The creature already existed in folklore and literature. What the novel did was gather several fears and rules into one enormously influential story. Count Dracula is old, intelligent, mobile, and deliberate. He plans his move. He buys property. He arranges transportations. He uses assistants in legal paperwork. The old revenant returns because death failed to hold it. Dracula operates like somebody building an invasion. The body remains important, but it becomes a tool the vampire controls. He can rest in boxes of earth, change shape, command animals, enter through openings that should not admit a person, and spread his condition to victims. The hunters respond with a mixed kit. They use records, schedules, medicine, sacred objects, garlic, physical force, and coordinated travel. They learn the rules while Dracula is already acting. That structure resembles a modern survival story much more than an old exhumation account. The monster has abilities. The investigators collect weaknesses. The ending depends on reaching the body at the correct time and destroying it in the correct way. Some details that now feel mandatory were not mandatory even in Dracula. Sunlight doesn't destroy Stoker's count. Daylight limits him and affects his power, but he can move during the day. The fatal sunlight rule arrived on film through Nosferatu in 1922. Count Orlok waits too long near a window. Dawn comes, and the sunlight kills him. That scene was so effective that later audiences treated the weakness as ancient vampire law. It is younger than Dracula. This is how fictional rules become folklore in reverse. A filmmaker invents or sharpens a weakness. Later stories repeat it. Eventually, viewers assume the rule must have come from the old villages. Garlic has older folkloric associations, though its exact use varies. Stakes also existed before Stoker, but they didn't always mean a clean strike through the heart with one approved species of wood. Sometimes the purpose was to pin the body. Sometimes the chest was pierced, because that was where the vampire's life was thought to remain. Decapitation and burning could be equally important. The invitation rule is another example of a useful story boundary. Modern vampires often can't enter a private home unless someone invites them. Older Revenant accounts don't give us one consistent doorway law. A dead spouse may return to the same bed without asking permission. A vrykolakas may disturb houses because the community already belongs to its world. The modern rule protects the home until a mistake is made. The older stories often begin after the home has already failed. Fiction also made the vampire's feeding easier to recognize. 2 punctures on the neck give the investigator a visual clue. Historical victims might only weaken, choke, dream, or die. There may be no mark connecting them to the grave. The cleaner rule set improves the story. It doesn't necessarily improve your odds. A creature with known limits can be planned around. Avoid invitations. Use daylight. Carry the approved religious object. Protect the neck. Locate the resting place. A local revenant with uncertain rules is harder. It may attack through sleep, illness, rumor, or a family connection. The same remedy may fail in the next village. Dracula gave the vampire a durable identity. Film gave it a deadly sunrise. Decades of adaptations kept revising the package. Most people prepare for that vampire now. It may be the wrong one. Suppose the reports are true. A person has died. Other members of the household are weakening. They dream about the dead. Somebody has seen the same figure after sunset. The grave is about to be opened. You may be dealing with a Serbian vampire, a Greek vrykolakas, a chewing corpse, a New England family revenant, an ordinary disease, or several unrelated events joined by a frightened community. The safest plan has to work before you know which explanation is correct. Start with the living. Record who is sick, when the symptoms began, where they sleep, what they share, and whether the same illness existed before the first death. Keep witnesses apart until their accounts are written down. Don't let one vivid story supply details for everybody else. Treat breathing trouble, fever, wasting, bleeding, and repeated illness as a medical emergency. Even inside a vampire story, the victims still need food, rest, clean water, air, and care. A supernatural explanation doesn't make the body's immediate needs disappear. Limit access to the suspected grave. A frightened crowd is bad at evidence and worse at safety. If an exhumation is legally and culturally unavoidable, it should not become a public spectacle. The people handling the remains need protection and professional knowledge. Nobody should eat, drink, or smear material taken from a corpse. Then identify the rule before choosing the weapon. If the threat must leave the grave, containment matters. If it attacks through the mouth, blocking or separating the mouth matters inside the story. If it remains connected to a particular organ, that tradition will target the organ. If burning is the only final remedy in the local account, a stake may only create a more violent second stage. Don't assume the most famous rule is the oldest rule. None of the famous weapons is universal. Garlic can fail. Sunlight may be irrelevant. A wooden stake only works when it matches the creature and the purpose people assign to it. Religious protections depend on the tradition and the relationship between the dead person and the community. Watch the living while everybody watches the grave. A person can exploit panic to steal, trespass, settle a grievance, or accuse somebody who was already unpopular. A real attacker can imitate a supernatural pattern because witnesses are prepared to see one. Lock doors even when the story says locks won't help. Don't let the accusation spread automatically. If the first intervention fails, that doesn't prove the dead person created more vampires. It may prove the remedy was unrelated to the deaths. Repeating the same act on additional graves increases harm without improving the evidence. Keep the knowledge boundary clear. Inside the folklore, these precautions are rational responses to a revenant. Outside the story, graves and human remains aren't objects for amateur investigation. Illness belongs with medical professionals. Burial disturbance belongs with the law, families, religious authorities, archaeologists, and trained death care workers. The old vampire panic becomes most dangerous when people stop making that distinction. There is one final rule that appears across nearly every case we have covered. The vampire gains strength from uncertainty. A family doesn't know why several people are dying. A village doesn't know why a corpse looks changed. An official doesn't know whether refusing an exhumation will cause panic. A traveler doesn't know which parts of a local story were witnessed and which were repeated. An archaeologist sees a sickle but can't interview the person who placed it. The blank spaces allow the dead to act. Modern fiction reduces those spaces. It gives the vampire a list of powers and weaknesses. The hunter can study the list. Historical belief was less generous. The rules could change while people were using them. A corpse that didn't respond to one method might need another. Continued deaths could mean the first vampire had spread the condition. Any failed test could become a new chapter in the explanation. That makes the most useful survival skill skepticism without contempt. Take the witnesses seriously enough to record what they experienced. Take disease seriously enough to look for transmission among the living. Take decomposition seriously enough to expect disturbing changes. Take fear seriously enough to know that people may act before the evidence is clear. You don't have to insult somebody to reject the conclusion they reached. The villagers who opened Peter Plogowitz's grave were responding to deaths they couldn't explain. The people who treated Arnold Paole's body believed they were stopping a spreading threat. The residents of Mykonos thought burning a corpse would restore their homes. The Brown family watched tuberculosis take one relative after another and used the only remaining action their neighbors offered. The vampire was not real in the way they believed. The danger was. Disease was real. Grief was real. The physical changes in the grave were real. The panic and the damage done to bodies were real. Those facts are what make the old vampire frightening. You don't need a castle. You don't need an immortal count. You only need one death, a second illness, and a body that doesn't look the way the living expected. Then somebody says the first person came back. By the time the grave opens, the story already knows what it is going to find. This has been TED Signal Index. Horror, folklore, and the rules that might keep you alive.